the art of cross-examination, because I was telling Nitesh that most of the lawyers I know now have now started from the appellate court, from the High Court and Supreme Court. And it is my belief that those who haven't started from district court may know the science of cross-examination, but not the art of cross-examination. But that's my personal belief. That's what I've seen over the years. However, Nitish was of the view that we should talk about the basics of criminal law, the basics on how to create a flow chart on how the criminal matters proceed, and to understand it from the very roots. Like me, how I learned criminal law and the procedure thereof. Uh, I think it's a wonderful suggestion. I think what is required is to understand the criminal law from its very inception. The idea being that we'll understand the why and not just what we have to do. And that is going to create a lot of inherent understanding of the criminal law for the young practitioners at the bar. At the first instance, before we get into the process and the flowchart, I think a lot of lawyers are asked, why are you a criminal lawyer? How can you save the lives of criminals, murderers, rapists, terrorists? And that's something that I've been asked for now so many years. And the answer, and I've really thought about it. And what I honestly believe is that we as criminal lawyers are the last bastions, the last safeguard of democracy. Because if we are not there, democracy per se would fall. There would be no democratic process. There would be no right to representation. And that is where criminal lawyers come forth. So as criminal lawyers, the whole concept being that the judge is going to decide the fate of a person. The police is going to investigate, but the test will be done at the hands of a criminal lawyer. I remember I read something, and I'm going to quote this, that some of us do it for the high of winning. Like me, I do it for the fact that when I go to the court and I argue a bail application, there's a high, there's this wonderful feeling when you manage to get relief. It's an instant gratification. Some, they say, do it for a higher purpose. Some do it to protect democracy, to protect liberty, and to protect humanity. There is an American author who actually said this, and I'm going to quote this, that my job as a lawyer is to digest other people's pain. It tastes bitter, painful, tear-filled, reminiscent of times past that haven't been past. It's not a job you want. It's not a job that's worth it. But yet we toil because it just may change the society. And that is what makes us criminal lawyers. That is what makes us lawyers. So without any further ado, let me just give you a brief background of criminal law, and then we will come to the process. Why this is required is because a number of questions come across young litigants, young criminal lawyers, when it comes to what do we do when such and such has happened. And to know that, it is best to go to the soul of criminal law, which emanates from a Latin maxim, actus non facit reum, nisi mens sit rea. All of us have read this. All of us probably rattled it for our exams, and most of us have forgotten it. But what it means is the act alone does not amount to guilt. It must be accompanied by a guilty mind. Two things, therefore, are important here. And that's how we will discuss what we have read and how we apply it as criminal lawyers. Actus reus, the act or the wrongful act, and mens rea, or the guilty mind. First, guilty mind. Guilty mind would have three parts to it. One, it could be intentional or reckless wrong, or it could be a wrong of negligence, which is carelessness, or third, it would be an absolute or a strict liability where the mens rea is not important. Mens rea means guilty mind. And guilty mind itself has two parts to it. One, act which may cause some harm. And second, act which may be considered wrong due to its very mischievous nature. And that is where a number of cases also come up Probably when you're starting off, those are the kind of cases that might come to you. This would be neighbor fights, issues pertaining to pets, somebody running illegal factory, etc., etc. This would come in the second part. Now, we will always remember that an act or an attempt and preparation. So act is one part, attempt and preparation being second part, are also subject to criminal liability. Now, the question that you might want to ask is, what is the measure of criminal liability? How do we justify whether somebody should get 2 years imprisonment or 2,000 rupees fine, etc., etc., etc.? So there are three parts to it under criminal law. First, which is very important practically, although not theoretically, is the motive behind the crime. And I will tell you why it is important practically and not theoretically. The second is the magnitude of the offense, what the offense entailed, the magnitude of the offense. And the third part is the character of the offender. Now, there's a difference between civil law and criminal law. In criminal law, the character of the offender is also an important factor that would be looked into. It is not the case in civil law. So when you're preparing your cross-examination, because there would be a number of criminal lawyers who might also be practicing somewhat on the civil side, you should understand that in civil law, there would be no benefit to you when you impeach the character of the witness. That is past experience of the witness. Also on the criminal side, that this would be important. Now, coming back to motive, because when we talk about 120B, criminal conspiracy, etc., motive is of utmost importance. Theoretically, the courts have held that motive may not be the most important thing. Motive may not be seen in a number of occasions. What goes behind or inside the mind or the heart of the accused, nobody knows. But practically speaking, motive in a lot of matters, in a lot of cases, to bring forward the story of the prosecution is of eminent importance. Otherwise, the story would be disconnected, more so in conspiracy cases. So therefore, though motive may not be the most important thing to bring the offense home to the accused, but it is a relevant factor to question the intention of the accused. Now, the motive is something beyond the intention. It is the ulterior intention, the real reason, the motive. It is different from intention. It's the ulterior intention. So they say ulterior motive, for example, where there is a direct evidence against the accused. Motive may not be that important. But where it is a case of circumstantial evidence, motive is, it's on a higher pedestal. So motive then gains a lot of importance. And any absence of it, if the prosecution is not able to prove the motive, it would go to the benefit of the accused. As I said, in criminal matters, all right. So this is something that I learned many, many years back when I was fortunate enough to brief a number of very senior, eminent members of the bar. Few of them have now been elevated to the Honorable Supreme Court and the Honorable High Court. Is that in criminal matters, law is important, but more important than law is knowing your facts. So if you even mess up on the law, God forbid, but you are strong on facts, you would still fare better than most of the lawyers. So your facts are important. And what is the takeaway from the fact is that you should have your story down pat. At the end of the day, in criminal practice, there are two stories that are told to the judge. One story is by the public prosecutor or the investigating officer. That is the story of prosecution. And then there is your story. The question is, whose story sounds more credible? How many loopholes can you find in the story of the prosecution? When the prosecution says that on such and such day, we went to such and such place and we recovered, for example, the weapon, you would then be finding loopholes in that story. When you went on such and such day, how did you go? What time did you reach? Did you reach there on time? Was it daylight at that time? Did you carry flashlight? How did you recover the weapon? Were you carrying any tasla? The question would be, where were the witnesses? Where did you get the witnesses from? For example, if the weapon is a churi or a katta, and it's been recovered after 2 months, 3 months, or 6 months. Was it still fit to be used? Was there any rust on it? So you're actually bringing out or showing the loopholes in the story of the prosecution. So there are two parallel stories. If you have the story of the prosecution down pat, you would also have your story in place. And at the end of the day, beyond all the legal precedents, what matters is the credibility of the story of either the prosecution or your story. So therefore, one more thing that you should always remember is, one, that you should know your facts. Of course, know your law, but know your facts. Prepare your story in advance. You should know how you're going to take forward your case. Now, coming back to motive. So the intention, in any case, relates to the means, while motive relates to the end. The intention could be good or bad. The motive could be good or bad. They're different. So therefore, if the intention is criminal, so what I intend to do is an illegal act, though my motive is pure, it still would be a criminal act. So my motive would be to feed the poor, and the intention on how I'm feeding the poor, the intent is to rob somebody. It's still a criminal act. So you should know the difference between intention and motive, because a number of cases that you do would have 120B as the end of the elephant's tail behind it. Quickly, I will deal voluntary causing, because there would be a number of cases that you would be dealing with that. Section 39 deals with voluntary causing an effect by means, which at time of employing those means, one had the knowledge that he is likely to cause it. Section 39. So there are three parts of voluntary causing. You may read this later, because what we are going to do is quickly deal with different aspects of criminal law before we come to the flow chart of it. Voluntary causing has three parts. One is the intention. We've already dealt with intention. So one is the intention. The second is knowledge that he may cause it. So you intend to cause it, you have knowledge that you will cause it, and reasons to believe that you will cause it. So three parts of it. Of this, the two takeaways for you would be your knowledge and your intention. Knowledge is where you have the knowledge that you can do something. Intellect, knowledge, where consequence is not desired. So the end result may not. You may have the knowledge, or you may go and search for certain information, but you may not have the desire to conclude it, take it to its natural consequences. So that is knowledge. Well, the intention, consequence is desired. So when you intend to do something, the intention to rob is different from knowledge to how to rob. So that is a huge difference, because in a number of matters now, what we have seen is when the FIRs are made, where civil cases are tried, are being given color of a criminal case, etc. Knowledge and intention is something where the complainant's counsel or the complainant is trying to play with. And that is where your knowledge of this basic segregation of law is going to come to your benefit. When we were talking about 120B, that's how we discuss it in our offices. That's the tail end of the elephant, because usually when you look at the FIR, it would have fla sections / section 34 / section 120B. You mentioned that I am the lawyer for the Home Minister's matter, which was a abetment to suicide matter, where they said that I or my client had the intended that such and such commits suicide. So there are three parts which are very important, which we call the tail of any criminal matter or section, FIR. We quickly deal with them. Section 34, section 120B, and section 117. 34 is very interesting. 34 is when, some people get together and they have the common intention of doing some crime. So for example, to beat somebody up. So they all say, okay, let us go and beat somebody up. And they go and beat that fellow. Now the police doesn't know who used his fist, who used a saria, who used a chaku, who used a rod, etc., etc., etc. So the police would say, where there is commonality of intention, everybody had the common intention to do something. So therefore, the section that they would put at the end of all the other cases would be under section 34. What does it say? Act done by several persons in furtherance of common intention of all. Each of such person is liable for the act as if done by him alone. So the entirety of the offense, without knowing who has done what, would be put on each one of them under section 34. This is used in cases where it is difficult for the prosecution or the police to distinguish between the act of individual members or to prove the exact participation of each member. So then in such a case, they would put a commonality or common intention under section 34. It has two parts. To bring forth a case under section 34, prearranged plan. Everybody should have decided, let us go and beat somebody up. Common intention. And then they should have participated in that. Not just thought about it, but went ahead and done that criminal act. Would be under 34. 120B, there is a huge difference. 120B is criminal conspiracy, a wonderful section, something that you're going to see again and again and again in all the cases that you probably are already doing. The whole premise of criminal conspiracy is where two or more persons get together, meeting of mind, both of them decide, both of them think of something together to do an act. And that act is illegal in nature. Or legal, but done by an illegal means. To withdraw money from the bank is all right, but to withdraw money by gunpoint would be an illegal act. Criminal conspiracy would then come into place. The mantra of criminal conspiracy is meeting of mind. So even if two people meet, but they do not know what is the intention in each other's mind, somebody might say, okay, let us go and beat somebody here, but the other person wanted to murder him. 120B will not be made up, because there has to be meeting of mind to commit that offense, for that occurrence of that offense to have taken place. So meeting of mind. And the act may not even be done. But where there is meeting of mind, conspiracy is already in place. It has already born. It is already there. There are two parts of conspiracy. One is direct evidence, where the prosecution has found direct evidence against your client. There is nothing more to say. The evidence is unimpeachable. It is there, which is rare. The other is indirect evidence or circumstantial evidence. Now, circumstantial evidence is something that you will deal day in and day out, and these judgments are wonderful. They say that the chain of each incident should be so entwined together to form an unbreakable chain of circumstances to create a case under circumstantial evidence. In these cases, motive is very important. Motive is important because at that time, the court will see why the act was done. If there is no motive, it will go in favor of the accused. So therefore, you will very carefully read the motive. You can challenge the motive. It will not take away your case completely. It will not lead to an acquittal completely, but it would be a very strong reason for the judge to see that there is something amiss, there is something lost, there is something which is not really there. Lastly, abetment 117 is something that you would not usually see, but it is worth knowing because again, as I said, it creates commonality of offenses. If a person is aiding, which means participating, helping somebody, aiding in an illegal act, and he instigates someone, kar le, do it, to do an illegal act, and then engages in conspiracy and acts in furtherance of that, it would be a case of abetment. Abetment requires something more. Abetment requires some kind of participation. It requires some kind of aiding. It requires some kind of instigation to instigate someone. I think that should suffice when it comes to the generality of law. One question that somebody had asked me and which I found very interesting was, so he had called me up and said, I'm very confused about wakalatnamas. I had a client and we got number of wakalatnamas signed. It was a criminal case and then he got arrested. And when I went to the court, the judge said, you do not have a wakalatnama. What do I do? And it just struck me that this is something that I used to do when I was younger, is when a client used to come to me, we used to get 10, 20 wakalatnamas signed and say that, jab zarurat padegi, use kar lenge. But the problem used to be if the client would be arrested, then those wakalatnamas would be a waste. Because once the person is arrested, his signatures have no value. He's in judicial custody. He's in custody of the police. And therefore, his signatures would have to be verified or countersigned by either a jail official, jail superintendent, or by the court for it to have any legal binding effect, for it to create an entitlement to you to represent him. So You should always remember this the moment, and it has to be for a specific purpose. So when a person is arrested, you have to fill the wakalatnama. You will have to say for the sessions court, for the high court, you have to fill it specifically and get it signed. So this is something which is a takeaway, which I was just, something that I just realized would be required. Coming quickly to journey from investigation to trial, understanding the basics of trial and trial practice. Most of us are already aware of this fact that the offenses are divided into two basic parts. And when I'm discussing this, I will also give you some landmark judgments that I have used over the time or read to understand the basics. And I would suggest that you read them if you are really serious about criminal trial practice. So the offenses are divided into two parts. As I said, one is cognizable, the other is non-cognizable offenses. There is a schedule in CRPC. I would suggest, like me, to take a printout of it and keep it somewhere so that you can quickly read it and make your notes and scribble it. It's actually a great help rather than opening your Gutka, your CRPC again and again. It's in Schedule 1, Table 1. It's just, I think, 5-10 pages. All you need to do is just take a photocopy of it and keep it with you. The cognizable offenses and non-cognizable offenses, there is a basic difference, major difference. Cognizable offense, the IO, the police can arrest without warrant. Non-cognizable offense cannot arrest without warrant. Basic difference. Second basic difference, which is not completely correct, but is used by us as a thumb rule and nothing more. Offenses 3 years less, non-cognizable, more cognizable offenses. What happens is, when somebody comes to the police and says that a criminal act has taken place, he is informing the police of a criminal act that has taken place. The police is duty bound to note it down. And how it notes it down is in a register. So the first information given to the police when put in a register is an FIR. Very simple. That is very, very simple to remember. It is under section 154. Again, most of you know that. Now, the points of the FIR by judgments are this: that an FIR is not an encyclopedia of the entire offense, the entire facts. It need not mention everything. But it cannot be a loosely worded FIR. It cannot be a very generalized FIR. There have to be specific instances. So an FIR is not an encyclopedia. However, it cannot be loosely worded. If it is loosely worded, it would end up in getting the same quash. Second, delay in registration of FIR is usually fatal to the case of the prosecution unless cogent reasons are shown. This is not the case in cases of rape matters, etc. And that's just a takeaway for you. Another fact is where there is, for example, somebody comes and gets a complaint registered. There are offenses which are cognizable and which are non-cognizable in nature. The fact that there is a cognizable offense would make it a cognizable offense where the FIR can be registered and the police can take action accordingly. Second takeaway for you is the moment FIR is registered and the prosecution and the accused is called, accused is entitled to a copy. I've seen number of cases where the police refuses to give a copy to the accused. It is incorrect. It is your fundamental right under 21. This is what the Honorable Supreme Court in Article 21, it has been said by Supreme Court in a number of judgments. So, I mean, that is the key takeaway from here. What happens in a non-cognizable offense? When somebody comes and, gets a complaint registered and it does not bear any cognizable offense, what would happen is that the police will then have to file a report before the before the magistrate. And this report would be under section 155. The Metropolitan Magistrate, the judge, is going to look at it and may ask the police to investigate it. If the police is investigating it, it would have all the powers of investigation, but no power of arrest. So beyond arrest, everything else can be done. It can call the witnesses, it can record statement, collect evidence, etc., etc. The investigation is done under 155(2), just a takeaway. Now, what is going to happen? What is going to happen in cases where an offense is registered or offense is stated, which is in the nature of a sexual offense? It is very important for you to know. Now, what happens is When a statement is being recorded of the witnesses, the statement is recorded under 161. The law is very, very clear. There would be no signatures of the witness taken by the police. Also, no inducement can be offered. But where a statement of a sexual offense is taken, there are two critical differences. One, in such a case, only a lady police officer would register the FIR. Secondly, the second most important thing is that a statement under 164 by the MM will be taken thereafter. So by audio video means is also something that has in the amendment has been said that an audio video recording will also be done. The second, the critical factor is that a statement under 164 by the MM will be taken. There are certain requirements for it. The MM is going to ask there is no force, undue coercion, etc., etc. Now, in other cases where the police may feel that, or the IO may feel that the witness is not a solid witness, or the witness can probably at a later stage turn hostile, it may choose to get the statement of that witness recorded under 164. Now, as a defense lawyer, when you have a statement under 164, you are also able to argue that the IO himself did not believe or trust his own witness, and therefore he was compelled to get a statement recorded under 164. That's an argument that you can make. There are certain judgments to that effect. You can see it's a defense strategy to basically challenge the witness whose statement has been recorded under 164, because otherwise that statement has been recorded by the MM and has a higher credibility value. Now, what is going to happen is that the moment FIR is registered, there's a prima facie case, the IO can arrest the accused. The powers of arrest in such a case are extremely wide and extremely powerful. Now, unless and until, now there has been an amendment, there have been a number of amendments, there have been an amendment in 2008, there have been an amendment in 2010. The power of arrest is under section 41. There was an amendment done, various amendments, and then there were certain judgments of the Allahabad High Court, then by the Honorable Supreme Court, also by our High Court. There had been amendment in law wherein offenses under 7 years. So the amendment is section 41A, which says that in case where there is no need to arrest, the police is not going to arrest generally just because an FIR is registered. They can send a notice to the accused. And if the notice has been given to the accused and the accused complies with that notice, then there would be no requirement to arrest him. And if there is any need to arrest him, there would be permission taken from the higher officer of the police. This is made mandatory in cases where offense is 7 years less. This is also, there are certain judgments to this, which I will give a little later, which may be required for you to read as those are relevant to the facts. But coming back, a statement under 161 can be used to contradict a witness by the defense, but cannot be used to corroborate your own case. So you can't say, listen, your witness has said this, I am relying on it. Great. You can contradict, you can't corroborate. In such cases where the witnesses come to the court and do not support the prosecution's case, at that time what is going to happen is they would be declared hostile. The public prosecutor will have the right to cross-examine him. Now, as I said, in sexual offenses, the law is a little different. There would be, 164 compliance, etc. Now, what happens is that the law believes that the police is able to conclude its investigation within 24 hours, which necessarily is not the case, which usually is not the case. Section 167 says where the police is not able to finish its investigation, conclude its investigation 24 hours, he will bring forth the accused to the MM as he's been arrested. Now, the law here is that the police can seek the custody of the accused for the purpose of investigation. Seek the custody, but the custody cannot be given for more than 15 days. It can be given in parts, so 2 days now, then judicial custody, again the police may seek, but it cannot be given for more than 15 days. The second takeaway is, which we're going to come, is as far as the charge sheet that is to be filed. So the charge sheet is to be filed by the police, which is a conclusion of the entire investigation of the police. So just a quick takeaway, inquiry and investigation are two different things. Police does not have power to inquire. Police has the power to investigate. The power to inquire is only with the court. So when you say the police is calling you for inquiry, it is a wrong way of dealing with that fact. It is calling you for joining investigation. So the four parts of any criminal trial would be investigation by the police, inquiry then by the court, trial again by the court, and judgment by the court itself. How the court moves from investigation to inquiry and other parts is when the police concludes its entire investigation and files a police report under section 173. The police report is filed where the police will say either no case is made out, please close the case, or would say case is made out, please register the case. At this stage, the court is only going to look at a preliminary prima facie case, only going to do a preliminary inquiry. Now, an unfortunate part of Indian system is that even when the police gets to have evidence which helps the defense, the police is not duty bound, the investigating officer is not duty bound to give that evidence or to show that evidence or put that evidence in the charge sheet. It may ignore it. Now, this is unfortunate because in USA and in other developed countries, the law is of complete disclosure, which means that whatever they have found in investigation would be handed over to the defense, even if it goes against the prosecution case. The rate of cases in India is much higher because prosecution or the investigating officer is not duty bound to disclose the entire investigation. That's the unfortunate part. This is what is the difference between India versus US of A and a number of other developed countries. Now, what happens if prosecution comes and says, listen, I don't think there is a clear case, please close the case. The MM cannot close the case on the mere asking of the prosecution. It has to send a notice to the complainant or to the victim. And the victim or the complainant is going to come and then challenge that closing order by way of something called a protest petition. Protest petition does not find mention in the entire CRPC. It is a creature of judicial decisions over the years. The judgment was a 1985 judgment, which is called the Bhagwant Singh judgment versus Commissioner of Police, where the concept of protest petition was brought in. Now, once the protest petition is brought in, the court would have various other rights. It can listen to the protest petition and say, there is merit, please register the FIR. Or it may say, okay, I am going to examine the witnesses of the complainant himself, and then ask the court, the police to register it. Or it may convert it into a complaint case, saying that I am not going to waste the judicial machinery. You can convert it into a complaint case and take it forward. But once, and the other option, of course, is once the charge sheet is filed, the MM can say, listen, I think you need to do more investigation. Go back and investigate more. An important takeaway is that in most of the offenses, the charge sheet has to be filed within 60 days, except in cases of death, life, 10 years, where the limitation is of 90 days. If the charge sheet has not been filed and the accused is in custody, he will get mandatory bail. He is entitled to bail on this ground alone, that the charge sheet has not been filed within the stipulated period. This is an absolute right. It cannot be challenged in any manner whatsoever. Or if the FIR is registered, if the MM thinks that, the case is made out, let us go ahead, then what it would do, and very, very important part, it would now apply its judicial mind. Applying its judicial mind is taking cognizance of the matter. Cognizance is taken under 190. Please read that section, those who haven't. It's very, very important. Mark it. If you're like me and you like to make notes, I would suggest that you make your notes in your book itself and keep that book with yourself, the Bayrak, and let it be your Bayrak, because it's very easy when you open that Bayrak and you see your notes on the left and you say, Achha, this is what has to be done. Now, when you take the cognizance, this is the first time judicial mind is being applied. There are three parts, three ways. One is on the complaint. When somebody files a complaint before the court, as I said, probably a protest petition, or when the police is not registering an FIR, you go to the court and you say, please consider it. So that is where it is on complaint. Second most important, which we are dealing with and which we mostly deal with, are cases on police complaint, where the process is the FIR is registered, etc., etc. And rarely when the MM gets to know, or the judge gets to know, a criminal offense through any other source, probably an anonymous letter, a letter sent to him by newspaper cuttings, etc., which is very, very rare. So coming back to the police complaint and the other complaint, when a complaint is received by the police, by the MM, what it would do is it would say that, okay, we'll make it into a complaint case. He will examine the complainant, the witnesses of the complainant, go through the evidence brought forth, and then direct, either dismiss it or direct the police to register an FIR. If the FIR registered, we go back to the same process as we were discussing. If it is dismissed, then the other framework comes, you challenge it, etc., etc. Or in the third case, once the cognizance has been taken, the court goes ahead with it. There is something called issue of process. An issue of process is when either warrants are issued or summons are issued by the judge. The warrants and summons are issued under 204, which is again a critical section, something that you should be completely aware of. Now, in a non-cognizable offense, the MM can still exercise the power under 156(3) by asking that the matter be investigated, be registered, etc., etc. But now to come back to the issue of charge sheet. Once the charge sheet is filed before the court or the MM under 173, he takes the cognizance. So we are going back. He takes the cognizance. Then he can issue summons, warrants, or in the rarest cases, in few cases where there is some confusion, he can also issue summon warrants. Summon warrants is an anomaly. It is under section 87. You can read it. It rarely happens. It's an academic discussion. But after the cognizance is taken, if he believes that this is a matter which is not triable by the magistrate, but triable by the sessions court, so warrants and summons cases, triable by the sessions court, he will then commit it to the court of the session. So the entire process in the beginning is before the magistrate. Committal later comes before the sessions court. But there are certain steps which are to be taken place. And when we were doing Gopal Goyal Kanda matter, and we were doing another matter many, many years back, which was a huge scam, number of hearings were wasted in this because the prosecution did not want to hand over the entire records of the charge sheet, claiming various things, voluminous, etc., etc., etc. An accused is entitled to the entire charge. In rare cases, the prosecution may refuse where the records are voluminous. You can get it printed at your own cost. Nowadays, all you have to do is ask for a CD or ask it in a pen drive, which is again something that I think is much, much smarter. But to come back, the accused is summoned. The accused appears. He seeks the copies of the charge sheet for the first time. And then you as a defense lawyer argues on the documents. Okay, so there is one more right which I completely forgot. At the case when the accused is arrested, the prosecution always wants police custody. This is the first time the defense lawyer appears and starts arguing whether police custody is required or not required. Because during police custody, he's in the custody of the police, he's a part of the investigation, and so therefore, I mean, that interrogation mode is there. When you argue that a prosecution does not really need police custody and you are able to send him to judicial custody, he is no longer required for the purpose of investigation. So your first right to also argue from bail at that moment starts. We're not talking about anticipatory bail, etc., etc. But we're talking that he's no longer required for the purpose of investigation or interrogation. He's in judicial custody and therefore he may be released on bail. The second stage, as I said, was now when you argue on the documents and the documents that are required, because a lot of times, especially in bigger matters, prosecution, for reasons best known to themselves, do not want to hand over the entire documents to you. So there is no fair disclosure, as I've already told you, unlike US of A, where the IO is not bound to give you the entire document, which is very unfortunate and something that you as young lawyers, young members of the bar should fight, should do something about, move that there should be fair disclosure, because it's very difficult for the accused to fight the entire government machinery. The IO has, to his advantage, the government machinery at his disposal. And you, as a teeny weeny small defense attorney, cannot hire investigators, cannot hire, forensic reports, etc., to help you in your case. And when the IO has it, I think he should be duty bound to give it. So to come here now to the aspect of committal of the case, as I've stated that in cases of summon trial and warrant trial, There are cases which get committed to are to be done by the MM, and certain cases are to be done by the session court. Now, the session tribal cases are dealt with in CRPC between section 225 and effectively till 233, not too many sections. Now, what happens is, in the session trial, the cases are open. So higher nature of offenses, session trial, smaller ones, warrant cases, and summon cases, etc. So session tribal cases, as I said, are dealt with in 225 to 233. The case is opened in the session court. The prosecution argues on the charge. You would argue on the discharge. You will say the case is not made out, okay, qua your client. If it is a single client, you will say that, charge sheet is a lot of humdum. There is nothing against your client. No offenses are made out, etc. The police has not done its duty correctly, or that the investigation prima facie is tainted, and you will bring forth certain facts. The difficulty that you are going to face now is that whether you can rely upon your own documents at that time, because the IO hasn't. There are various judgments that permit you to rely on your evidence if it is unimpeachable in character, if it is unquestioned in character. But usually that is something which the courts do not allow you. You have those judgments with you, which you can use. Now what happens is that unless and until you are discharged or you plead guilty, the matter then goes to goes further. How it goes further is that the charges are made out. And once the charges are made out, it starts with prosecution evidence. The takeaway in prosecution evidence is that the witnesses are called, the chief examination is taken place, the cross-examination takes place, the prosecution has the right to re-examine. A key takeaway here is that the public prosecutor may decide that where the witness has turned hostile, is not supporting the case, may declare him hostile and then cross-examine him. So therefore, he has the right to cross-examine him. And then you, of course, have the right to cross-examine him further. The second important aspect is that usually you can limit yourself to what the chief examination has been. As I told you, you will see with section 161 and you can contradict him, not corroborate. Limit yourself when you're preparing the cross-examination to what has been stated in the chief examination, unless and until there is something supports you there in 161, which you can bring forth and corroborate and then contradict him. That is it correct that you in 161 made this statement? If he says yes, it becomes a part of your evidence and you can use it further. The second stage is that at the stage of the prosecution evidence, if the court feels that there is no case made out, there is nothing at all, I don't know why you've been brought in, the court can acquit you even at that stage, not going further. It's under 232. I did a very famous scam, which was called the MCD insurance scam, where my client had been acquitted after the first prosecution witness was brought by the court, saying that there could have been negligence on the part of my client, but there was no criminal conduct at the part of my client. It's a very well-known case. The second aspect, of course, is after the prosecution evidence, what happens is that the entire case of the prosecution has to be put forth and given to the accused. The accused then gets to know what the case against him is, because the nature of the case would change from what the charge sheet was and what the what the witnesses have been brought by.
Sir, we cannot hear you. Your video is.
Is it? Is it fair now?
Yeah, now it's okay. Now it's okay.
All right. So as I was saying, that after the prosecution evidence, what happens is that for the first time, the defense gets to know what the actual case against you is, which has been created in the court by the police, by the public prosecutor, by the government. And this is a statement under 313. Questions would be asked. It is against you, such and such. What do you have to say? In the previous era, all you had to say is, I deny. But now there are Supreme Court judgments that say that you also have to give a cogent reason. If you're not given a reason, it would be taken against you. So this is the time when you not only beat the case of the prosecution, but you also introduce your story, your case. And then that case has to be met in defense evidence. There are wonderful cases where judgments of the trial court have been challenged in High Court saying, listen, this was not put against me in 313. So I don't know how the judgment is based on this allegation when there was nothing against me in 313. This can be argued. It is a huge lapse. However, now the High Court or the Appellate Court can also could you just silence? Thank you. Can also choose to at that time investigate or ask questions from the accused in 313 and give him that opportunity in the Appellate Court, in the High Court. Now, all the circumstantial evidences questions have been put under 313. Now the defense brings his defense evidence and brings forth his case. Once that is done, and the IO has cross-examined your witnesses, then the judgment, the issue of judgment comes. The court will then pronounce you after final arguments, your guilt or your acquittal. A very, very quick strategy on how your final arguments should be prepared is this. But of course, you're supposed to read the charge sheet, read the FIR, but most importantly, read 313 and structure your charge sheet and your FIR in terms of the questions put under 313. Once you do that, you put the witnesses under those brackets which have been brought in to prove that evidence or that allegation against you. It would be very easy for you then to understand the case of the prosecution and also to understand how you're supposed to meet your defense. A couple of takeaways right now is that as far as investigation is concerned, the can't direct the IO to investigate in a particular manner. It is illegal. There is a wonderful judgment to that effect. It is called the Inderjeet Mukherjee judgment, which said that the does not have the power to direct the nature of investigation. However, there is also judgment that says that the High Court can interfere in the manner of investigation to save grave miscarriage of justice, which is an Eastern spinning mill judgment. It's the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court, 1985 judgment. I would urge you to read that judgment. Where protest petition has been filed, investigation can be checked into by the So that is a strategy that you might remember, which you can probably look into at a later stage. So therefore, this is the entire structure of how the investigation, the CRPC moves, how criminal trial moves. One important thing that I would quickly just deal with is something which has been asked in other forums, is what are the kinds of the bails? We know that there is anticipatory bail, there is regular bail. We've already discussed something called compulsory bail, where 60 days or 90 days having been over, you will compulsorily be given bail. There is no question to it. Now there is also something called a transit bail. Many of you are aware of it, where an FIR is registered outside the jurisdiction of the court. So for example, an FIR is registered in Kolkata and you're residing in Delhi. Now what happens? You have to go to Kolkata. There are also judgments that say that since you are under the legal jurisdiction of a particular court in Delhi, the Delhi court also can grant bail, but that's a rare argument to make. Not usually successful. What is usually successful is transit bail. That you say that, listen, I have to go to Calcutta to prove my innocence, but I am afraid while I'm going to Calcutta, I will be arrested. Please protect. So the court under those circumstances is going to grant you something called transit bail. What you do is you say that I need 30 days or 20 days to go to Calcutta or to whatever place. The court is going to say, no, nothing doing. I'm going to give you 10 days. You can ask your client to go there. He will have 9 days to hire the attorney, lawyer to find out what has happened against him. So this is something called transit bail, something again, which is very important. There are some judgments that I would tell you to read, very, very important, something that we use day in and day out, which are arguments on bail. Sanjay Chandra bail is on the question of when charge sheet has been filed, you're entitled to bail. It is a wonderful weapon with a defense lawyer when he's arguing bail. The other is Sushil Ansal matter, again, which is on where question is bogies raised that, they would be tampering of witnesses, etc. This is again a wonderful judgment to be used. Now, to conclude, there are 5 or 6 strategies that I have learned over the years from some wonderful lawyers, which has helped me. which when people are also, when you get to brief senior lawyers, the advantage is that you can pick their brain and you can learn a lot from them and learn their strategy. So all of this has come from experience and also from experience of other senior lawyers who have been gracious enough to teach me. And some of them, and very important, criminal law is based on facts. Law will help you, but there's a huge discretion of the court. So if you have to argue between fact and law, always prefer fact over law. Law is used, or precedent is used to sharpen your argument. It is not something that your argument should be based on. So trust your instincts, sharpen it with precedents. If you think instinctively this will happen, this is what the strategy should be, trust your guts because you read the facts and you've come up with a strategy. Then you can find precedents to see whether, zero loss theory, a wonderful precedent to follow. So in white collar crimes. And there's something which is very wonderful. It's a joke that they say that more important than knowing your case, or more important than knowing the law, is to know the judge, which is very true, but it's been misused. When they say know your judge, it means go and sit in the court and hear the judge. You will realize when you sit for a couple of hours that every judge has a strategy to come to a decision. Certain judges like long winding arguments. Certain judges want very succulent to the point arguments. Certain judges get swayed when you just refer Supreme Court judgments or precedents. Certain judges do not appreciate it. Know your judge. Very important. Sit in his court. You will understand the strategy of your argument, how you're supposed to put forth. One more thing that somebody once taught me, there was a senior lawyer I know, he used to go and have chai with the court staff, and I once asked him, sir, why? This was in Chandigarh. And he said that, more important than knowing your file is knowing the court staff, because they have been there longer than you have been. And I think that was a brilliant advice given. Don't fight with them. You need them. You need them for no other reason. When you go to the court and you see the court staff that half of the confidence comes from there itself. One is how to prepare a brief. I like to make my notes in a diary, and I like to keep that diary for a particular case and segregate it with 10-15 pages so that I never lose it. And then I scan it and I keep it with me so that if there is any problem, I can always refer to it. The second thing, if you're like me, as I said, you would want to make notes in your Bayer Act and keep that Bayer Act with you so that when you open that particular section, you would know something highlighted, what is important, what is it that you want to see, what is it that you want to hear or read. It's there. If you want me to give you citations, I would be more than happy to give them of the judgments that I have said. But I would first advise you that you try and find them out yourself, and failing which, of course, I would be more than happy. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them, or I will give you 4 or 5 judgments that I think are necessary and something that you should be reading.
Yes, the session was very informative, and we do have lined up certain questions for you. And the questions are very interesting, relating to the criminal trials only. So the first question which has been asked is that if the bail is filed before on the basis of FIR sections, but during the bail hearing, if the IO says during investigation he applied harsher sections, we are charging the accused, which gives power to session court to give bail, then what will happen to the bail before the
So the is also empowered to grant bail. It is something that is not usually practiced, but please read the sections. You will see that the is also entitled to grant bail. But what usually happens in such cases is that in cases where the case is not yet committed, the matter will be with the right? And so therefore, the as I said, is entitled to grant bail. The will hear the argument.
Sir, but what would be the cases with related to the punishment of the death and this life imprisonment? Because there is always lies a confusion that whether we shall move a bail when the charge sheet is not filed before the or not, or we shall directly wait for the filing of the charge sheet. Because they say that the first stage is to file before the and then to go before the session after the rejection.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And, I remember many years back when I started my practice and, on the criminal side, there was a very senior lawyer. He's no longer there. He was supposed to be at that time, supposed to be the god of Tisazari court. I mean, there was no bigger lawyer than him. And, when I used to be preparing, I used to be sitting in the canteen on the civil side and making my notes. He had this very interesting way of saying, ki kake hole hole. So his concept was that you should never miss a rung or a ladder that you have. He said that you might not get relief is another story. You might believe that. But the fact is that if a rung exists, use that rung before you go. At that time, what had happened 20 odd years back, what had happened was that it kind of started becoming fashionable to push a case as fast as possible to the High Court. I mean, there were a lot of wonderful judges also in the High Court at that time, that's true. But it kind of became fashionable in Tisazari and Patiala House to push a matter to the High Court. And this senior, wonderful senior, I think at that time there was no bigger senior on the trial side, on the criminal side. And he used to say, hole hole, use the first rung before you move to the second rung, before you move to the third rung. So the fact that there is an availability of a rung should first be taken. That is one. Secondly, should you be waiting for the charge sheet to be filed, or should you be waiting for should you move the bail? So my suggestion to you is this, that when a person has been arrested, it would be dangerous on your part to move bail when police custody is given. And so therefore you fight on the quantum or the time of the police custody. But once the police custody is over and you bring, and the accused is now sent to judicial custody, your first right to move for the bail automatically comes up. Because what your argument will be that now he is no longer required for the purposes of investigation. And therefore to keep him in custody would to be punishing him before the judgment of the court itself, before conclusion of the trial. So every day's incarceration now would tantamount to punishing him for something which has not even been decided by the court. So you wait for the charge sheet to be filed would be a very dangerous, unfortunate situation as a trial lawyer, because the accused also is in a hurry. He's being incarcerated every day. His family members would be coming to you and asking you, sir, kya hua? Ya ma'am, kya hua? So what you do is you fight for a limit to the police custody, and then you move for the bail once judicial custody has been granted.
Okay, sir. So thank you so much for this answer. So the second question is, I think, though not related to the criminal trial, but there is stigma for which this has been asked by Mr. Shobhit Mahant. What should be the role of social media like Twitter and WhatsApp by sharing irresponsible and without any genuine news on these platforms? The person is termed as accused without knowing his or her side of the story. So I think it's a more of like a moral question being asked.
In fact, Hitesh, this is a very important question, and I'll tell you why. When you're fortunate enough to do matters which are there in the media, which are there in the news, when you're fortunate enough to do that, you realize that most of your battle is not in the court with the public prosecutor, but with the public perception. So what happens, and we've done a number of matters for some very large politicians, some very big cases. Now, what used to happen is that we would realize that the day we are moving the bail, the police machinery would leak certain facts about us, and it would be there in the morning news. Now, the judges themselves are human beings. They read the paper. And once they read the paper, when you're in the court, and this actually happened, is when we were arguing a huge matter in Rohini. I had the court ask me, "Arey, aapke baare mein to ye likha hua hai, vakil sahab, aap kaise justify karte ho? Aapke client ke baare mein ye likha hai." And it's an uphill battle. So the question is very, very important. What is it that you can do? You can, at the first instance, the moment you get any material against you in social media or in the news, which is factually inaccurate, you send a notice. You put them to terms, you send a notice and you say that, my client would be constrained to file a defamation suit, etc., etc., etc.
Exactly.
The second, of course, is that, you can file writs there is a case that I had done, which is called the Aruna Chadda matter and Chand Swarup matter, Delhi High Court, where the court has laid down that the media has to be responsible, and if they are irresponsible, the courts would be constrained to step in, and they have given certain steps and certain advices to them on being socially responsible when they are publishing the news. So it's actually quite a material question, and I know that police misuses their office by planting stories against your client, especially in cases which have some kind of highlight which are there in the news already.
So that's just a perfect answer for this, and I think many of us would be utilizing this as a resource and tool while dealing with the criminal trials when such news will come in the newspapers which are factually wrong and incorrect against our clients.
I sure hope so.
Third question is, if the charge sheet is filed without arrest of the other accused and that accused has been declared as proclaimed offender, then what is the remedy for the counsel who is going to appear for the proclaimed offender accused?
See, proclaimed offender, the concept of proclaimed offender is a totally different ballgame. Because once he is declared a proclaimed offender, you have to see the procedure 82, 83, 84, etc. You have to get the proclaimed offender, the order of proclaimed offender cancelled. You have to seek bail. You can't seek anticipatory bail till the time the order that he's been declared PO has been reversed. So that's a completely different ballgame. We can probably have another webinar only on the issue of proclaimed offender.
Thank you, sir.
There is somebody who just asked me a question, strangely on my phone, saying, can you please explain what zero FIR is? So if I don't know why, but any which ways. So I'll just quickly say what zero FIR is. So what happens is when somebody goes to the police and says that, such and such thing has occurred, please register an FIR. The police would usually say that, "Arey, ye meri jurisdiction mein nahi aata." Would say that this is beyond the territorial jurisdiction of that thana and ask a person to go somewhere else, which is illegal. The police cannot do that. The police is duty bound to register the FIR, and after registering the FIR, may then transfer that FIR to the thana who has the jurisdiction to deal with that FIR. That FIR, where you do not have the territorial jurisdiction, but you still registered an FIR, is called a zero FIR. There are some judgments which I would ask you to read, which is very, very important. One is called Punati Ramullu judgment, which is a 1993 judgment, which said that non-registration of FIR is illegal. You have to register the FIR and transfer it. The concept of zero FIR. And there is another judgment that might help you. This is a Gujarat. This came from Gujarat. I'll give you the citation of this. 2010, AIR 2010, Supreme Court 715. And in this judgment, it said that the IO, the investigating agency, can still investigate the matter even if it doesn't come under the territorial jurisdiction, and then eventually transfer it, etc., etc. So there are two judgments to that effect that might be of benefit to you. Is there any other question?
Yes, sir, there is one more. Sir, if the accused has been arrested for a petty offense like stolen mobile or scooty or bike, when the FIRs are not available with the advocates or with the family member, so then in that case, when there is a pressure from the family to apply for the bail, so what should, as a prudent advocate, we should do?
You see, as I said, copy of the FIR is your inherent right. Now, as a prudent advocate, if now the law is that the FIRs, once an FIR is cut, it would be uploaded and you can download it from the site. But in many offenses, that is not the case. As a prudent advocate, there are two things you can do. One, go to the thana, demand a copy of the FIR. It is, after all, your right under Article 21. You show that you are the lawyer for such and such person. At times, the police would say, no, but we can only give it to the accused. So bring him forth, which of course is not possible. The second is that the report has to be filed before the which you are aware. And then as prudent, smart lawyers, you know how to get it once the report has been filed. I need not say that. I think all of you are very, very smart about it. So there is absolutely no question of you not getting it. It is right there in front of you.
So the part which you just said before in your webinar, in the session, sir, that knowing the court stuff is more important.
Exactly, sir.
You know, I'll tell you a quick story. When I started as a lawyer, what used to happen, I started from Tisazari, and there were 4 or 5 lawyers who were supposed to be the doyens of the court. There were R.K. Anand Saab, there was Pandit Naseem, brilliant lawyers. And what would happen is that most of the juicy matters would come to these lawyers only. But it was only during summer vacations or vacations that lawyers like us, the younger lot would get an opportunity to argue bail and, some juicy matters, so to say. Otherwise, kismat mein nahi tha. I mean, it would be very, very rare. The advantage that lawyers like me and a number of lawyers like me had, because we were at that time focusing only on Tisazari, is that we were very friendly with the court staff. So when a matter would come to us and we would go there at the lunchtime, we would know when the matter would come up, when the file would come up. And at times also, small little things like Zada mat boliyega. So you would know that this particular court wants it in, point wise. You do not go on a verbal diarrhea and you continue. And the fact when you were standing in the court and you know that you know the court staff and the court staff has smiled at you, would give you a lot of confidence, would give you an ego boost. So know your court staff. Very, very right. Very important. As a criminal lawyer, very, very important.
Sir, another question is, though I'll be taking it very quickly, sir, is there any right with the defense counsel to get 164 statement?
So the 164 statement is a very interesting statement. It is a statement that is recorded and then put in a seal cover. And that seal cover is kept by the court. It is not given to the police. It cannot be opened up. It will only open up during trial once that witness is brought forth. And only when that witness is brought forth and that copy is taken out from the seal cover, would the accused be entitled to get a copy. This is hugely used in cases against women, cases in sexual nature, etc., etc. But these statements have a special power associated with them. These would be with the court. Even the IU will not have a copy at that time.
Okay, sir. Thank you for this. Sir, another question which is lined up, I think it's very important question. And I think I had a discussion with you in this regard. The question which is lined up, it says, sir, what should be the appropriate stage for a defense counsel to stimulate his defense, whether at the stage of the beginning of the case, at the stage of cross-examination, or as you just said, the 313 CRPC?
The story or your case should be done from the very first instance. Now, there are 2 parts of it. At the very first instance, your risk when you're arguing the bail and you're putting forth your story is that you may give a heads up to the IO to fill the lacuna to his case in filing the charge sheet. So, though you know your case, though you created your case at the first instance, but you will have to wait for the charge sheet to fructify and concretize your case and your story. And then your story should run from there, because when you're cross-examining the witnesses of the prosecution, you will have to put forth your case to the prosecution witnesses. You cannot bring it suddenly in the defense side when the defense evidence is being brought. So you will say that I put to you such and such. Is it true? Such and such. During cross-examination. Those are called suggestions. And those suggestions are basically vehicles putting forth your case. An important takeaway, a huge advantage that you as defense lawyers have is that there is a flaw in our criminal system. The flaw is that the office of the police is separate from the office of the prosecutor. So there is no connect between the office of the police or the investigation and the office of the prosecutor, except in certain cases where the IO may write to the public prosecutor on certain question before he's filing the charge sheet. But in most cases, he does not have the advantage of asking the public prosecutor. And so the public prosecutor also gets to know the case after the charge sheet is filed, when a copy has been given to him and a copy is given to you. Okay? So therefore, you can from that instance itself, start developing your case, start putting your case, etc.
So likewise, sir, it should be at the starting from the first instance, you should frame in your mind that what is your defense and act according to that.
See, that should always be there. Once the client comes to you and tells you what the case is, you should have a brief structure as to what your defense strategy would be. As I said, the defense strategy is based on fact. It is tempered or sharpened by precedents. So when he comes and he tells you the story and you write down that story and you break that story, you also start finding judgments to see whether there is something that helps you in further developing that story of yours. But the actual case is created when the charge sheet is filed. Your defense is fructified. Your defense is fructified at the time of 313. You follow?
Got it, sir. So
Yes.
I think with this, we are finished with the questions. Shobhit, I think all of your questions has been asked by me. You said there is one third question which is to be asked.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, Nitesh, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Yes, all three questions has been asked, and sir has been very kind. And sir, in respect of procurement offenders, sir will be giving us another informative webinar very soon.
Anytime.
Yeah, we have already caught him for this proclaimed offender. We'll be very soon.
It will be another learning experience like today, sir. Thank you for your time.
More than learning, I think we have been taught in a way that how to deal with the things as a criminal lawyer, defense lawyer in the court. How minute are the situations and how critical are the points that those have to be taken care of. So with this, I think the questionnaire is finished. Now I am handing over to Siddhi, who is also our moderator for today, for giving a thanking note to Kapil Sankla sir for this wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitesh sir. Good afternoon, sir. Sir, first of all, thank you so much for this webinar. The topic was really informative, and learning from your experience, sir, and learning all those stories of your initial years were very insightful. And altogether, sir, it was a very stimulating experience for especially young lawyers like us to learn all these arts which you've learned over the years. Sir,
Exactly, sir.
It was altogether an stimulating experience for all of us, and sir, we hope that we'll see you soon with once again with another topic like we're discussing about the proclaimed offender. So thank you so much, Kapil sir. Looking forward to moderating and hosting another webinar with you.
Thank you, Siddhi. Thank you for having me over, Ritesh. Thank you, all of you.
Just with the last words, I would like to thank not only Kapil sir, I would like to thank Siddhi, who have been the moderator. I would like to thank Tanupriya, who did the introduction part, and it would, out of place to mention, not to mention Mr. Naginder Benipal, who is a member executive of Delhi High Court Bar Association, who helped me in approaching and going to sir for having this wonderful session of webinar. Thank you, all of you, and thanks to all the viewers and participants who had been there in this short journey and listening to the texts and arts of conducting a criminal trial. Thank you, sir. We'll be soon looking for another webinar on the proclaimed offenders very soon.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, please.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot. Thank you for having me over, and I look forward to being connected with you on various other occasions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Nitesh, sir. Thank you, sir.